Welcome back. I hope you're all doing well and keeping healthy and washing your hands and keeping your spirits up and enjoying the story, which I will continue today. All right, Chapter 7, Love and Lovecraft. Mayor Chowder could let no such tragedy befall our little village without alerting the greater authorities. By the following afternoon, a company of the regiment arrived from Hornwood and set up camp in the pastures across from St. Dismas. Like the sprouting of mushrooms in a single night, neat lines of white canvas tents appeared in an instant, and just like that, the village doubled in size. The narrow streets grew crowded with over 100 new men and an equal amount of horses, and every businessman, from the grocer to the blacksmith, rubbed his hands together with anticipation and looked upon the hungry men with a greedy eye. In any similar situation, such an influx would produce bedlam, but the soldiers were disciplined and highly focused on their task at hand, to seek out any hint that could explain the bizarre nature of Earl's fate. Those in positions of authority were unwilling to call it a murder, but in pubs and alehouses, the consensus was that a foul deed had been performed, and it remained in general agreement that the event was the most uncanny to ever occur in quiet Dunham, and thus demanded answers. How could the boy have been so fully encased in the body of a long-dead tree? What sort of logic could explain such strangeness? While the excitable Mr. Poole devised conspiracies involving fairies and the man on the moon, Father Noonan chalked it up to the omnipotent will of God. No one could provide a decent solution to the fundamental nature and the very foundation of the death. How could we expect to know more of the who or why, if we could not even explain the simple aspect of how it had transpired? In the days following Earl's discovery, soldiers went forth in shifts to look for clues to the itinerary of the boy's abduction. How had he gone from bed to tree? At first, ladies did not venture out at night, and small children were kept close to home. Fear gripped our hearts, but the constant sight of red jackets and black horses eased our minds that we were protected, and slowly the town returned to its old patterns. Gossip remained lively and brimmed with conjecture. The bakery, of course, remained closed. Dr. Gelder diagnosed Mrs. Rabbit as fallen into a catatonic state after suffering a terrible shock. There was no medicine that could revive her, and Mr. Rabbit had worn himself into a stupor with restlessly pacing the countryside, having lost for all intents and purposes both his son and his wife. Mary took it upon herself to experiment. She spent every leisure hour in the garden trying to understand Earl's fate. If only she could conform the laws of physics to recreate the manner of his demise, using logs and bits of cooked chicken left over from dinner, she might be satisfied. She scooped cavities in the wood with the head of an axe, or pounded the chicken into a pulp with the sledgehammer, but every attempt was futile. Dear, stubborn Mary found herself unable to engineer the murder scene. Her experiments were ultimately of no consequence, but her actions brought her a small comfort. Jane and I sought comfort in our own ways. I searched through Papa's books for similar circumstances, but past historians proved reluctant to share any gruesome mysteries, opting instead to speak of Dunham's farming practices and family lineages, and I could locate no such evidence that such a baffling manner of death had ever transpired. His death was unhelpfully unique. Jane drew pastoral images of rivers and bridges, as she often did under stress, and her landscapes were beautiful, tranquil things, reminding us of quieter days. Emma locked herself in Papa's tool shed and busied herself with her inventions. We knew not what she was up to until one afternoon when a great shout erupted from the yard. "Harry, Harry, you must come!" And so I did, along with Jane and Mamma in tow, hurrying out of the kitchen with skirt hems held aloft. By the time we reached the tool shed, my youngest sister had rushed to the yard to meet us, brandishing one of Mamma's small silver bread plates above her head. It was smeared and streaked with black ink, and the finely decorated edges had been bent into warbled lines. Mamma shrieked upon the sight of the plate. "I've done it, Mamma," Emma said in triumph. "Oh, and so you admit it," came the horrified reply. "Oh, my good silver! Ruined! Mercy, child, you will be the death of me." Emma ignored our mother's final throes, and turning to me said, "Look." There, scorched into the reflective surface, was an image of trees and path. I recognized it instantly as the vale below the heath where we had found Jane's parasol. I gave a gasp. "This is the result of your camera obscura?" I said in wonder. "Goodness, Emma, I can't believe it." Can you imagine such a marvel? To see a singular point in time solidified in light and shade, a full host of blacks and grays, with each line frozen like a spider in amber. I took the plate in hand, agog with wonder. "And look," she pressed further, pointing to a section of the image. There were the trees as I remembered them, and the grassy verge and the underbrush, and amongst all the greenery I saw a figure, blurry with motion, that must have been myself, wandering through the ferns like a wayward phantom. Emma's finger led my eyes up into the branches, where the pointed tip of a large intrusion hung down from the leaves. The edges were crisp, for it had been as still as a statue, but in form it did not possess the lacy delicacies of vegetation. It was thick and stout, sharply tapered, like the rounded conclusion of a massive fang. "Is that—" Jane screamed. "There it is! The snake's tail!" "We didn't see it because it must have been garbed in the same pattern as the trees," explained Emma. "But without color there's only form, and it's so different from the shape of the branches that it's easier to see in black and silver." My mother would hear no more. "You have ruined my grandmother's silver," she wailed. "Ruined it! What am I to do with you? And today of all days, when we have the Cripplegates for dinner, how am I to entertain them with soot all over the bread plates? Oh, by all that is good in the world! First my daughters are chased by a dragon, and then poor Earl is murdered, and now my plates are ruined. I feel faint." I think that my... There. Seem to be dropping. Okay. "I feel faint." "Mamma, surely you must be amazed." "I am only amazed by your sister's foolish nature," she wailed in my direction. "Oh, mercy, mercy! Does no one care for my delicate constitution? Do you not see how much you wear upon me, Emma?" Jane and I traded glances of utmost disbelief, but Emma seemed genuinely wounded by Mamma's fit. "You have so many silver plates, and I didn't think you'd mind if I used—" "You didn't think! A more true statement has never been uttered," Mamma continued, winding herself up again. "Give it here, my daughter, and we shall never speak of this again. Come along, hand me the plate, and we shall clean it off as best we can before Beatrice sets the table." "Mamma," I protested, "surely even you can see the importance of what Emma has created." "A few squiggles of ink, a smudge of a person, and this snake of yours which looks to me more like a vine? Oh, I see what Emma has done. She has ruined a perfectly good platter," came the reply. "What does this show that a fine painting could not? And without benefit of colour, and all black and silver. If Emma wishes to capture pictures, then Jane must teach her the art of watercolour. That skill will provide her with more opportunities than all this nonsense." My mother took back the bread plate and rubbed one finger over the finish. "Ah, see, it comes off with no trouble. No lasting harm has been done." "Mamma," I said in horror, but too late. "Harriet, you will not encourage such ridiculous, ruinous behaviour in your sister," Mamma replied firmly. But Emma had endured enough, and she fled from the yard with tears on her face, running down the mill road and running towards town. "Oh, Mamma," I spat, exasperated, and took off after Emma to comfort her. My youngest sister was very fleet of foot, and I only managed to catch her when she stopped to rest against the stone rails of the village bridge, halfway across the span. A more pathetic vision would be difficult to conjure. Emma's face was blotchy and puffy from crying, her skirts were covered in dust and soot, and her hands were spattered with black ink. A smudge of charcoal ink marred her chin. The trickle of villagers crossing the bridge paid her very little attention, and some of the younger women gave Emma a sidelong look, but no one wished to embarrass her by mentioning her frightful condition. "Hateful old shrew!" she sputtered as I reached her. I embraced her without care or regard for the state of my own clothes. "You have devised a wonder, Emma. Our mother is simply too small-minded to recognize it. But you must show me how you accomplish such magic, every step. Use up all the silver plates in the dining room, I insist. I want you to cover them with pictures. Honestly, they'll come to me upon Mamma's death, and I'll be most upset if they're clean and shiny when I inherit them." This coaxed a faint smile from her. "I haven't yet figured the best way to fix the image to the plate," she replied. "There's still a few problems to solve with the process." "Oh, and you are the best qualified to discover them, you clever girl," I replied. Mary and Jane were hurrying along the road towards us, and I hailed them. "Oh, you poor duck," Mary said as she enfolded Emma in her arms. Jane, shaking her head slowly in wonder, said, "Oh, Mary, I wish you'd have seen it. Emma caught the vision of the creature in the woods, and it was just as I remembered it." "If only we still had the plate we could show the regiment," I said. "But I suppose there's no hope of that now. It'll be cleaned and buffed to a high shine and covered in biscuits, and Mamma will have warned Beatrice against leaving any silverware within Emma's reach." Our spot on the bridge offered an unobstructed view up the river to the pastures where the army tents had been pitched, providing a fine vista of men riding back and forth in groups of 4. A few of the younger boys were fishing on the north bank, and among them sat Marvin Runkle, the short, tow-headed, freckled boy who had been Earl's constant friend. The others had moved past the loss of their schoolmate with the capriciousness of youth, but Marvin stared into the glittering waters forlorn. He toyed with an empty slingshot, but ignored the smooth stones along the shore. "I heard he's not recovered," said Mary, seeing the direction of my gaze. "He's lost his only friend," Jane replied, "and no one can give him the pale comfort of knowing how or why." Mary sighed. "I have no idea how it was done. I've tried with hammers and stones and brute strength, but are you quite sure, Harry, that you saw them carving the body out of the tree?" "It was as if Earl and the tree were one, grown together, with the ancient and long-dead tree sprouting a few little leaves," I replied. We fell into an uneasy silence, each tending to our own thoughts. A cluster of men trotted up the bridge on their groomed black steeds, their crimson uniforms bright and merry, their brass buttons sparkling. They were led by a middle-aged officer with a broad face and clean-shaven jaw, sitting erect in his saddle, and as the horses reached the apex of the bridge, the officer lifted his hand and hailed us. He had eyes of the palest ice blue, and his curled mustache was a fiery ginger red, but his most arresting feature was the puckered white scar that bisected his chin and right cheek, doubtlessly attained in a long-past skirmish. "Ladies, good afternoon," he greeted in a melodic baritone. Jane replied, "Good afternoon, sir." "My name is Captain James Crankshaw. This is Mr. Richard Marsh, Mr. Daniel Keel, and Mr. Elijah Frame." We each introduced ourselves, and there was a great flurry of doffed hats, tipped chins, and flourishing hands. The captain smiled to each of us in turn, only giving a little pause at Mary. With her mammoth frame, she could be quite arresting to those who assume all girls are petite and small. To his credit, he covered his awe by feigning a cough, and he tipped his hat and smiled at her. "Very lovely to meet you all. Could you point us in the direction of the undertaker's home?" "Mr. Winterbottom lives on the far slope of the river in that direction," said Jane, pointing downstream towards the beige 2-story house on the eastern edge of town. "You may find him there, or you may find him in the pub yonder, the shuttered door. On many afternoons after tea, he meets with Mr. Poole to play at darts." "Oh, no, Jane, if he's not at home, he will certainly be at the bakery," said Emma, turning back to the captain. "Earl was the baker's son, you know. The funeral is scheduled for tomorrow, and if there are further arrangements, he'll be with the grieving family." Captain Crankshaw nodded in thanks and nudged his horse to a trot. The soldiers began to follow obediently, save for one, the fellow introduced to us as Mr. Marsh, who paused his horse and looked with great concern at Emma. "Excuse me, miss, but are you well? You look stricken." She blushed. "Thank you, yes, I'll be fine," she assured. "'Twas a difficult afternoon, but my sisters have endeavored to make all right." "You have a smudge of soot on your chin," he noted, and fumbled in his sleeve to withdraw a plain handkerchief. "Please, take this with my best wishes. Once you've dried your tears, I hope you have no further occasion to use it." Mr. Marsh passed it to her and carried on, but not before he gave one more tip of his hat to Emma. "What a generous fellow," said Mary as he trotted away. But I was barely listening, as I was wrapped tightly in my own thoughts. "Highly unnatural, all of it," I muttered to myself, watching the curve of the waters and the froth upon the current. "When you talk in all seriousness of Earl embedded in a solid tree," Jane began, "I start to think the laws of science no longer apply to our current situation." Mary gave a snort of derision. "You can't simply abandon the laws of science, Jane. They don't turn on or off like the flick of a switch." Rolling her eyes, Jane leaned against the bridge rail and said, "But consider the facts, Mary. Don't you think we invalidate the laws of science with our quirks? Every time we use them, we make a mockery of what science knows. Emma shouldn't be able to ease pain with a touch of her hand, and yet she does. I shouldn't be able to sway one's opinion, but I can. And Harry shouldn't be able to read minds, but—" "I don't exactly read minds," I corrected, and Jane cast me a withering glance. "Oh, it's close enough, Harry," she replied. "We've never questioned our quirks because they're all we've ever known, but don't you think it's a little strange?" "So, do you think your ability to play the piano has some mystic quality? Or Emma's inventions spring from some occult source? Or that my singing voice is phantasmagorical too?" Mary challenged. "Of course not. We simply have talents like anyone else." "No one else in Denham has talents like ours," I pointed out. "Not that we're aware, no," said Mary, "but maybe they keep them close to their hearts too. Or maybe all of our quirks can be attributed to the Lovecraft line. Maybe strangeness is in our blood." A shout echoed over the waters. Upstream, the boys had caught a trout and were congratulating each other. "I won't give up on the laws of science," she continued. "It's the foundation upon which all knowledge is built. If the laws appear wrong, it's only because we have not yet discovered what influences them. Her devotion to the natural philosophies remained unshakable. Fine, I said at last. Science has not abandoned us, but you have to admit, it's taken an unexpected turn. At my comment, Mary relented. I will admit, none of our quirks and talents are as drastic as embedding a living man in solid wood. She gazed off into the distance. I don't pretend to understand how you can do the things you do, but nor am I willing to give up and proclaim science worthless, simply because one or two things have yet to be explained. But we agree that something strange is going on, I replied, and I turned to recline against the bridge side. And Earl didn't end up in the bridge of his own choice or volition. Someone must know what's happened, and I'm not content to stand by and tremble in terror. I turned to my sisters. Come with me to the footbridge. Maybe we'll see some small detail that the men missed. I have choir to attend in the hall, said Mary. And the Cripplegates are coming for dinner, said Emma. And I've promised Charlotte a piano lesson after we're finished dining, and I dare not wish to disappoint her, not when so many other things are in turmoil, said Jane. I scowled at them all for being so damned responsible. Besides, Harry, what do you hope to find? Emma asked. There isn't a square inch of Dunham County that hasn't been searched. Yet the situation gnawed at me. Perhaps I'd spent too long alone with my moth-eaten books. I felt there might be purpose here, and a puzzle to solve. Jane lay her fingers upon my wrist with the light touch of a feather. Listen to reason, Harry. You don't wish to look further. You'd rather let the men who are trained in combat deal with this dangerous situation, she said. I knew a half-second after she touched me what she intended to do, but by then it was too late. Jane felt that my intention was too much beyond our scope or accomplishments, and my younger sister used her considerable charms to turn my opinion, so that we instead returned home to help care for the younger children. As always with Jane's quirk, I knew my pliancy to be her doing, but I was compelled to feel good-natured about it. A bout of Jane's hocus-pocus makes one cheerful, even if they find themselves suddenly going against their original intentions. By the evening, my autonomy had returned. I was frustrated by Jane's trespass against my free will, but I was grateful, too, for the way it soothed my mind. I'd been in a fretful state since witnessing Earl's mangled remains, and I'd slept poorly for days. Her touch could calm the most troubled constitution. Still, she knew she'd trespassed against me, and as we prepared for bed, she apologized. I really don't like doing that to you, she admitted, as she slipped under her quilt and blew out the candle. Jane was, at the very core of her being, a caring girl, and full of sympathy for those around her. This was lucky for us, I suppose, given her ability to bend one's will to her own needs. A streak of cruelty through someone with Jane's talent would be the making of a tyrant. Give me your hand, I said, pointing my palm out towards her bed. In the darkness, she slipped her fingers into mine. Her apology felt deep and genuine. She had acted out of love, not malice. There was a tone of self-loathing in her, too, which surprised and humbled me. She looked up to me, and it had torn at her to bewitch me against my wishes. Do you believe me now? I let her go. Yes, I do. You feel very badly about it. Very. I forgive you, I said, but only with the promise that you'll never do it again. I promise, she said, but you can be rather stubborn, Harry. It's your worst trait. Yes, I suppose I could be a bit of a mule when I have a notion in my head. Even now, as Jane rolled over and her breathing slowed, I was in no mood for rest. My thoughts tumbled over and over like stones under a waterfall. The serpent in the woods, Earl's raw face, the peevish Mr. Blackwood, the stalwart Captain Crankshaw. So many elements that did not yet fit together. In frustration and grief, I wept quietly, hiding my face in my hands. After all, Earl had been a bully and a pest, it's true, but that didn't mean he deserved the end he'd been wrought, torn to pieces to free his corpse from its bizarre tomb. Eventually I calmed, and by then Mary and Emma were snoring from the other side of the hall. Lying there, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling in confused sorrow, I finally gave up trying. It was no use staying in bed. What was it that Jane had said on our walk home from the Darlings' luncheon? Oh yes, I feel as though the very fabric of my reality is unraveling. Down the stairs I went in my nightgown and bare feet, out the kitchen door into the courtyard. The garden was moonlit and drowsy, the air heavy with mist and pleasantly cool. I strolled to the huntsman's oak and sat on the low branch for a little while, watching the moths flitter from daffodil to crocus. The mill road was empty. To my right it stretched away towards town, and to my left it climbed up towards the wild hinterland. Directly across the road lay rolling cow fields as far as the distant farmhouse of the Cripplegate family. Despite our encounter with the snake in the woods, I didn't believe Earl's death was the result of a mere beast. Why would it stalk him in his bed? Why would it drag him to the footbridge? And most tellingly, why would it leave him stuffed in the middle of a tree rather than devouring him? Animals have simple motives, and none of them fit. People are more complex, but I couldn't think of any reason why a person would wish Earl harm either. Dunham was tiny, with a population of less than 300. Everyone knew each other. I wasn't certain that a villager could have dispatched Earl in such a brutal manner, but nor could I think of an individual who would want to. What would motivate a person to target poor Earl? Yes, he was annoying, but of no great threat to anyone. He scribbled in books, and he chased chickens, and he threw rocks at pigs, but none of these are a capital offense in Dunham County. To go to the trouble of snatching him from his house, leaving behind no trace of their passage, and then somehow to interweave his living skin and struggling bones amongst the fibers of the time-worn bridge? Who, how, and why? As I sat there, wrapped in widening spirals of perplexing thoughts, I grew more and more aware of a faint rustling sound, emanating from across the yard, amongst the lavender bushes. I sat upright. It was the same noise I had heard with Jane in the woods, a hushing breath and a soft swish, like the passage of a rat in the long weeds. Fear sparked in my chest. I squashed down the impulse to run. I knew I must not react immediately, but stay calm and still and train every sense towards it. Some living thing was here, only a few feet away from me, yet I saw no hint of it. The peaceful garden remained as still as a pastoral painting. I saw nothing, and yet 4 or 5 paces from my bare feet, a patch of mist swirled as if recently disturbed. I drew up my naked legs. The sound had come from one far corner of the garden, and the hint of motion from another. My heart thumped in my ears. If this was the snake, then it must possess the ability to move very quickly, to have gone from one side to the other in the blink of an eye. I searched the grass for many long minutes, finding nothing. Then a twitch caught my attention. The snake lay directly across the path to the door. Its colors were a perfect mimicry of the moonlit lawn. If it had only lain still, I would never have spotted it, but the serpent's thick body slithered across the path, disturbing the mist and the dewy grass. Good Lord, it was as big as a tree branch, its girth as thick around as my bicep. I climbed a little higher into the oak to watch the creature move in slow and patient undulations through the plants. The skin was the same color and pattern as the lawn and the leaves. It matched the environment so perfectly that I had to stare hard at its passage just to keep track of it. Then, tearing my eyes from it for a second, I glimpsed across the yard and saw a coil of rope by the front door of the house, only a few paces from the stone well in the middle of the yard. An idea occurred. If I grabbed the serpent and wrapped a loop of cord around its neck, I might be able to pull it to the well and shove it down into the inky depths, trapping it. Mary was the fastest runner. She could fetch the regiment, and they could eradicate the monstrosity, and together we'd return Dunham County to its quaint and unremarkable habits. This plan rang clear in my mind. I focused all my attention on that invisible motion, the slithering worm slipping through the trembling grass. I took a deep breath. I sprang. Both hands seized up the body, squeezing tightly around it, and I pulled back with all my strength, heels digging into the soft dirt. There was a yowl, not unlike the high-pitched screech of a startled cat. The snake thrashed. It jerked at my shoulders. I pulled, teeth gritted, to drag it out of the flower bed. Then, under the pressure of my grip, the cool, silky flesh yielded. Instead of recoiling, it whipped itself 3 times around my arm and jerked me towards it, much stronger than anticipated. I realized in horror that the beast hadn't made sounds of passage on either side of the garden because it was quick. No, I'd seen it move in 2 places at once because it was immense, and I'd sadly misjudged its size and shape and identity. This was no snake. The color of the skin, which had so perfectly matched the grass, now flickered and changed like the sky at dawn. Shifting veils of blue and turquoise overtook the greens and blacks. The changing hues leaked along the tendril and up to the huntsman's oak, twisting around the tree, across the yard, between the stone paths. Tendrils slithered between the flower beds, reaching almost as far as the house. Even if I had Mary's strength to lash a rope around it, this monster would never fit down our well. It had been flattened against the ground, but now it reared up in surprise. The body was as big as a bull, with massive tentacles spreading across the entire front yard, and its limbs wrapped around the trunk of the oak. 2 eyes flashed open at the base of the low branch, the pupils a warm gold flecked with dark chocolate brown. Like the devilfish of the Pacific, or the octopods of the Mediterranean, this beast was a master of camouflage, able to transform its shape to hide against any background. The seething tentacles moved with remarkable power and dexterity, and my eyes swam as I tried to focus on the ever-changing skin. Its limbs had been green as grass, its shoulders had taken the shape of a root bowl, its body had been rippled like bark against which it had pressed itself. But with my interjection, all of that changed. Now, at the point where I grasped the tentacle, shimmering tones of blue, gray, and silver poured out in waves, the hues of molten lead and candle wax. It wrapped another tendril around my arms and pressed lines of suction cups to my skin. And then, flowing from its touch, I felt its soul. Such all-consuming loneliness, such despair, such terrible disgust that eclipsed any meager sorrow that I'd ever before experienced. The beast's loathsome melancholy filled me up like brackish water. I struggled to escape, I fought to breathe, but the tentacle only clenched tighter as I felt myself dragged deeper and deeper into its heart. It released me suddenly, and I pitched backwards to the earth, stunned. The amber eyes blinked twice. Seeing that it had winded me, it turned and fled in the direction of our back garden. Without thought for my own safety, I dashed after it. The creature slapped around the frog pond and over the stone wall, and I heard the moist sound of its tentacles on the rocks, but I lost sight of it in the pastures. The sea of long grass moved and swayed with its passage, but it had once more changed its color to match the landscape, and it plunged headlong towards the driveway of Northwich Hall, and beyond the road the copse of swaying alder saplings. If it was heading for Dreadmore Heath, it would pass over the river and through the woods, and once it met the trees it would winnow into the branches and disappear, and I would lose it completely. So, I ran full tilt after it, night-gown flying. It didn't pause. The devil was as fast as a galloping horse. I knew I couldn't catch it, but I wanted one clear view of it, the gigantic churning knot of tendrils and golden eyes, just to assure myself that I wasn't completely insane. I saw the wake of grasses part at the roadside, and the dark form roiled over the dusty track, and then down the opposite verge. The surface of the river erupted in a series of splashes. Then it crawled over the cobbled rocks on the far shore, fully exposed to the night air and the silver moon. My breath caught in my throat. It looked back at me. Of that fact I am most certain. Those round amber eyes met my own gaze, and for a moment we stared transfixed, openly appraising each other. Then, reluctantly, the curling, coiling tentacles slithered up the shore and into the trees, and it crawled as smooth as quicksilver up the trunks of the willows until its skin had turned the same pallid color, and it vanished fully. Maybe it watched me from the safety of the trees, maybe it fled for the heath, I don't know. I stood in the middle of the wide parkland, trembling, flexing my hands open and closed. At the point where I had seized its tentacle, I could still feel the phantom sensations of its colossal despair, as keen and persistent as a paper cut. I knew, without hesitation, that it had no intention of hurting anyone. Not me, not my sisters, not Earl. It was freakish and repulsive, true, but this creature was not responsible for the death of the baker's son, and I would stake my life that it had never laid one harmless tendril on that poor boy. No, the beast was sad and lonely, but one emotion thrummed even more powerfully than its grief. It was utterly terrified. That's the end of this chapter. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye!